This is chapter 5. We are going to talk about one of the most significant periods for the Jewish people in history. This chapter will discuss the Roman invasion of Judea and the Levant, Emperor Augustus and King Herod, the story of Jesus and John the Baptist. We will also talk about Caligula. My name is Simon. I'm a tour guide. Stay with us. This will be fun. At 63 BC, Rome was still a republic. The balance of power was such. Pompey was the most famous and ambitious general they had. Julius Caesar was his partner. He was also a general and a politician, but Pompey was the big guy. The third party was Crassus, the financier. His role was to pay off the Senate and keep them happy. They were known then as the first triumvirate. Pompey was fighting a war in Anatolia. This war ended with Pompey conquering the entire area of Anatolia, Syria, the Levant, Judea. In 63 BC, Judea was fighting a civil war over who would be king. Pompey had been asked to intervene, so he did. Judea became a client state of Rome. Judea at the time was already very much divided between two geographic areas and two religious entities. Did they like and respect one another? We will soon find out. The Galileans lived up north of Jerusalem. They were separated by 4 donkey days from Judea. In between the two areas was the not-so-friendly Samaria. People of the Galilee were mostly Pharisees. They had a strong belief in the afterlife, a practice of studying, praying, and interpreting Jewish law, and the strong distaste of the Sadducees. In Jerusalem and around it lives the Sadducees. They were mostly of clergy orientation. They practiced through sacrifice of various animals in the temple of Jerusalem. Sadducees saw themselves superior in all ways over the Galileans or the Pharisees of all kind. In fact, they saw themselves superior to everyone. In 53 BC, Crassus, who was also a general, was fighting a war against the Parthians, and regretfully, he was killed. Consequently, Pompey and Julius spoke about how they wanted to run things and became enemies. And Pompey had his hands full in a bloody civil war. The last thing he had was time for him to interview candidates for jobs. Now the office of governor of the Galilee had become available. So Pompey made a management decision and picked a young, talented individual called Herod. Now Herod was quite capable. He grew up in Rome. He knew the business. Jews hated him because he was a Romanized Jew, of course, or worse, of Edom bloodline. Herod thought this was very unkind of the Jews. He made up for this sentiment by loving himself and being very capable as a governor. Regretfully also, he was a sociopath and a murderer, and I mean this in the negative sense. As for Herod, stupid he was not. During the 40s, a few years after the unfortunate business with Julius Caesar and Brutus, the Parthians invaded Judea. Herod had to leave for Rome, actually in quite a hurry. By the time he got back, he was backed by a Roman army, a fine friendship with Mark Antony, and his lovely wife Cleopatra. He was also holding the precious title of King of Judea. The friendship with Mark Antony was put to the test in 31 BC. Augustus, who was emperor, was fighting a civil war against Mark Antony. Herod was officially on the wrong side, Antony's side to be exact. In the naval battle of Actium, Herod and his fleet sailed in support of Mark Antony. Here I need to point out, when Rome fought civil wars, they were very civilized about it. It was only the armies that fought, and decent people just stood on the sideline and waited for the outcome. Herod terrible distress, he arrived to the battle a week late. He was not the seafaring kind of guy. The battle had been won by Augustus. Herod met Augustus sheepishly. He was at his mercy. Augustus apparently was having a good day. He accepted Herod's friendship and loyalty. For the next 27 years, Herod ruled Judea and the Galilee. He built Caesarea as a new city with a fine port. He also rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and several monumental palaces. He got married several times and had plenty of kids. I have to say to Herod's defense that he didn't kill all of his kids, and some of his wives survived too for a while. But in general, Herod was a poor family man. He was a little suspicious of his family members, and that had implications. During the final days of King Herod, 2 babies were born in Judea. One was John, later to be known as John the Baptist, born to Elizabeth and Zachary, and the other, Jesus, born in Bethlehem to Mary and Joseph. Elizabeth and Mary were cousins, and Jesus and John became great friends. Sometimes I am tempted in my narrative to think of the term waterschmendrick. So, if you ever wonder what a schmendrick is, think about the personality of Herod. Then Herod died. Jesus started preaching in the Galilee. He preached in Nazareth and in Capernaum. He preached across the Jordan River. He preached in Jerusalem. Jesus' followers thought that he was the Messiah, and they made such claims. They made everybody very worried. The last thing people needed was another Messiah who will revolt against Rome. Jesus had a beautiful message. He gave people hope and happiness. He was especially popular with the lower classes and in the Galilee, less so with the Jewish authority in Jerusalem. The Sadducee clergy in Jerusalem realized eventually that Jesus was a serious threat to their power, that he was dangerous. Judea at the time was ruled by a Roman governor called Pontius Pilate, and any other year the clergy in Jerusalem might have charged Jesus with heresy or blasphemy, but alas, they had lost the power to exercise capital punishment. They needed the Romans to do their dirty work. Jesus was crucified on April 33 AD. The date is marked today by Easter. Later traditions and writings elaborate his message. A small but tenacious following formed around his memory. Those were the first Christians. Mary, Stephen, James, and several of his disciples made a home on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Paul carried his message further into the Roman Empire. Peter became the first pope. Early Christianity was seen as a serious threat to Jews and Romans alike. It was banned and the actual practitioners were persecuted. In 37 AD, Emperor Tiberius passed away. A young and good-looking Caligula became Emperor of Rome. He is said to have been a little disturbed emotionally. Later actions of his might support this claim. He was assassinated 4 years later to everyone's relief. Alexandria was a big hub those days. About 750,000 people lived in the city. Jews constituted a third of the population. During the 4 years of Caligula, statues of the emperor were used to decorate Jewish synagogues. This was against Jewish tradition. Consequently, riots broke out. The Greek population drove many of the Jews out of the city. It had quickly turned into a pogrom. Many died. Perhaps this is a good time to introduce another Jewish faction that was active both in Judea and the Galilee. I'm talking about the Zealots. They were both Farsi and Sadducee in persuasion, but most of them were in fact Parsi. They generally had difficulty adjusting to Roman rule. Furthermore, they formed militias around leaders. Underground movement. They were training for rebellion. Many of them were willing to give their lives for this cause, and so they did. While Emperor Nero was busy with his musical phase, unrest was felt throughout the empire. In Rome, St. Peter was crucified. In Jerusalem, St. James was stoned to death. The Roman governor of Judea was crucifying people right and left. Mary had become the leader of the small group of Jesus' followers in Jerusalem. She realized things had become a little too dangerous. They managed to leave Jerusalem just in time before the Great Revolt started. During the years of Emperor Nero, several rebellions took place in the empire. They especially intensified after the big fire in Rome in 64 AD. In Caesarea, too, riots against the Jews broke out. The Zealots retaliated against the local population and fought against the Roman soldiers that protected them. Within weeks, Judea and the Galilee were in full revolt against Rome. The Great Revolt had started. I regret spoiling it for some. It didn't end well. We're going to end this chapter now. Rome was rebuilding itself from the fire. The Christians were banished from Rome. Nero is about to die, and the great Jewish revolt was about to take place. Things were happening. Stay with us for future chapters.